This was the life of a farmer in the USA. In 1955, farming killed more Americans on the job than police work, firefighting, mining, or construction, more than any other occupation in the country when measured against the number of workers involved. The rate of work-related deaths in American agriculture ran at 23 per 100,000 workers, 7 times higher than the national average across all industries. Every year, approximately 1 in 10 tractor operators overturned a tractor at some point in their working life. 1 in 10. And in 1955, virtually none of those tractors had a rollover protective structure, the roll bar or reinforced cab frame that would eventually become standard equipment and would, when combined with a seat belt, reduce tractor overturn fatalities dramatically. In 1955, when a tractor went over on a hillside or into a ditch, or when a front wheel dropped into soft ground and the machine pivoted, the man on the seat was pinned under tons of steel with nothing between his body and the ground except whatever space the terrain happened to leave. Sweden would not require rollover protective structures on tractors until 1959. The United States would not make them standard on new tractors until 1985. 30 years of tractor overturns. Thousands of deaths that a roll bar would have prevented. And alongside the mechanical dangers, the tractor, the combine, the power takeoff shaft, the grain auger, the hay baler, there were the chemical dangers that 1955 was only beginning to understand. The pesticides and herbicides that the post-war agricultural revolution had introduced into the farmer's daily work at a scale and concentration that no previous generation had encountered. What was it like to be the American farmer in 1955, standing at the center of all of that? The American farmer of 1955 was a figure in transition in ways that he could feel but could not yet fully see. In 1955, there were approximately 5,370,000 farms in the United States, employing about 12% of the labor force, down significantly from the 1945 numbers and falling further with each year. The mechanization that had been accelerating since before World War II was continuing to transform the economics of farming in ways that favored larger operations and squeezed smaller ones. A departmental study in 1955 found that 2,849,000 farmers out of a total of 5,370,000 earned less than $1,000 per year. More than half of all American farmers were operating below what any reasonable standard would define as a viable income. The average farm of the era covered roughly 216 acres, larger than the family farm of previous generations, reflecting the consolidation that was already underway, but still small by the standards that the emerging agribusiness model would eventually establish. The farmer who worked those acres in 1955 did so in an environment of cost-price squeeze that had been a defining feature of American agriculture since the end of the post-war commodity price spike. The prices he received for what he grew were determined by markets he could not influence, while the prices he paid for the inputs, seed, fertilizer, fuel, machinery, credit, rose steadily with the general inflation of the American economy. Getting bigger was the rational response to that squeeze, which is why farms were getting bigger. But getting bigger required capital that most small farmers did not have, which is why many of them were getting out. Before we continue, comment below if you have ever worked in a dangerous job. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss our upcoming content. Thank you for your support, and let's continue. The Farmer's Day in 1955 began before the sun came up. This was not a romantic detail or a cultural affectation. It was a practical necessity, driven by the specific demands of livestock, of growing seasons, and of the extended summer days when the work that had to be done in daylight could not wait for a more comfortable hour. A dairy farmer was milking cows at 4:30 or 5 in the morning, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, because the cows produced milk on the same schedule, regardless of weather, holiday, or personal circumstance. A grain farmer in planting season or harvest was in the field as early as the dew would allow, trying to cover as many acres per day as the equipment, the daylight, and his own endurance permitted. Harvest in particular imposed a pace that overrode everything else. The weather window for bringing in a mature crop was finite and unpredictable, and a farmer who missed it by a day or two because he had stopped to rest lost not just a field, but potentially the financial viability of his year. This urgency was not lost on the accident statistics. Harvest season was the most dangerous period of the agricultural year, when fatigue from weeks of extended hours combined with the pressure to keep moving to produce the conditions in which the split-second judgment errors that ended in machine accidents were most likely to occur. The machinery that a farmer in 1955 operated was substantially more mechanized than what his father had used, and substantially less safe than what his son would use. The tractor had replaced horses on most American farms in the decade following World War II, and with it had come a range of powered implements: plows, discs, cultivators, planters, sprayers, that extended the tractor's utility across virtually every field operation. The power takeoff shaft, or PTO, was the rotating shaft that protruded from the rear of the tractor and transferred power from the engine to implements like mowers, balers, and combine heads. It rotated at 500 or 1,000 revolutions per minute. In 1955, PTO shafts were typically unguarded. There was no protective shield between the spinning shaft and the people working around it. A loose piece of clothing, a frayed rope, an inattentive moment reaching across the shaft to adjust something on the implement. Any of these could result in the clothing being caught and the person being wrapped into the rotating shaft in a fraction of a second. PTO shaft accidents were among the most severe injuries in American agriculture, producing crush injuries, degloving injuries, and amputations that were almost always catastrophic and often fatal. The guards that eventually became standard on PTO shafts were among the most cost-effective safety improvements in agricultural history, preventing injuries of extraordinary severity at minimal cost. In 1955, many farmers did not have them. The grain auger and the grain bin presented a different category of hazard that was becoming more significant as on-farm grain storage expanded in the 1950s. An auger is a rotating screw inside a tube used to move grain from one location to another, from a truck bed into a storage bin, or from a bin to a truck. The screw rotates inside the tube and moves grain by friction and mechanical displacement. It also moves anything else that enters the intake, including hands and arms, with a speed and force that exceeded the ability of anyone to react quickly enough to prevent severe injury once contact was made. Grain bin engulfment. The hazard of being pulled into a partially empty grain bin, where the grain was flowing toward a suction point, dragging a person down into it as if into quicksand, was less common in 1955 than it would become as grain storage expanded, but it was already present as a recognized hazard on farms with significant grain storage operations. The specific danger of flowing grain was that it moved faster than a person could escape once the flow started, and that the pressure of grain against the body, once partially engulfed, was sufficient to prevent breathing even before full submersion. The chemical environment of the American farm in 1955 was undergoing a transformation whose health consequences would not be fully understood for decades. DDT, which had been developed as a pesticide during World War II and had been promoted aggressively in the post-war years as a tool for controlling insect pests in agriculture, was in widespread use on American farms in 1955. The organophosphate pesticides, including parathion and malathion, were coming into agricultural use as alternatives to DDT for certain applications, and they were acutely toxic to humans in ways that DDT, which was toxic primarily through long-term accumulation, was not. A farmer applying parathion to his fields in 1955 without adequate protective equipment was handling a nerve agent, a compound that inhibited the enzyme acetylcholinesterase and could, in sufficient exposure, cause seizures, respiratory failure, and death. The protective equipment that the era's understanding of agricultural chemicals recommended was minimal by any standard applied in hindsight. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, which would document the environmental and human health consequences of pesticide use in terms that the general public could understand, was not published until 1962. The regulatory framework for agricultural pesticide safety was incomplete and weakly enforced. Farmers mixed, loaded, and applied chemicals that were genuinely dangerous with the same casualness that the era applied to most occupational chemical exposures, because the specific risks were not yet fully established in the public record, and because the culture of farming had always involved working with things that could hurt you if you were careless. And this was just the latest version of that. The financial structure of American farming in 1955 was built on a foundation of credit, weather, and commodity prices, three variables that the farmer could not control and that interacted with each other in ways that could make or break a year's work, regardless of how hard or skillfully he had farmed. Spring planting required seed, fertilizer, and fuel that had to be purchased before any revenue was generated, typically on credit extended by the local farm supply dealer or the bank. The crop that grew from that investment was exposed to whatever the weather delivered between planting and harvest. Late frosts, drought, excessive rain, hail, insect pressure, plant disease. And the farmer had limited tools in 1955 for managing any of these risks. Crop insurance programs existed, but were not yet universally available or adequate in their coverage. When the crop came in, if it came in, the price the farmer received for it was set at the elevator or the livestock market, not in any negotiation the farmer participated in. A good year in the field could still be a bad year financially if commodity prices had fallen between planting and harvest, as they had done repeatedly through the post-war period. The cost-price squeeze that was driving consolidation and the exit of small farmers from the land was not a temporary condition or a correctable policy failure. It was a structural feature of the agricultural economy that favored scale and disadvantaged the individual family farmer who was trying to make a living on a couple hundred acres with equipment payments, credit, and no pricing power over what he produced. The farm community in 1955 was one of the most self-reliant social institutions in American life, organized around the specific requirements of work that could not be done alone and that could not wait for convenient scheduling. Neighboring farmers helped each other with planting and harvest operations, sharing equipment and labor in ways that the economics of mechanization made increasingly practical and increasingly necessary as the size of individual farms grew. The cooperative system, the farm co-ops that bought inputs in bulk and sold them to member farmers at reduced prices, the marketing cooperatives that pooled members' production for sale, was a significant institutional feature of rural life in 1955, providing a degree of economic collective action that partially offset the pricing disadvantage of individual farmers facing large buyers. The rural church, the grange, the county extension office, and the 4-H program were the social infrastructure around which community life organized itself in farming counties that had been losing population to the cities since the end of the war and would continue to lose it for decades. The farm wife's labor was integral to the economic functioning of the family farm in 1955 in ways that the formal accounting of agricultural production consistently undercounted. She kept the books, managed the household economy, raised the children, cooked the meals that sustained the people doing the field work, helped with livestock operations, and in many cases operated equipment when the labor demands of the farm required it. She was also the person who absorbed the specific anxiety of agricultural life most directly, who watched the weather and calculated what a late frost or a dry August would mean for the year's finances, who managed the household on the income that agriculture produced in a good year and on whatever reserves existed in a bad one, who held the family together through the cycles of abundance and shortage that farming produced. The farm family's financial stability rested on variables that were outside anyone's control, and living with that uncertainty across a lifetime was a specific form of psychological labor that had no name in 1955 and no recognition in any accounting of what farming cost the people who did it. By 1955, the trend line for American family farming was already unmistakably pointing toward consolidation, mechanization, and the progressive displacement of the family farm by larger operations. The number of farms would fall from 5 million in 1955 to fewer than 2 million by the end of the century. The percentage of Americans who farmed would drop from 12% of the labor force in 1955 to less than 2% by 1990. The farm that a man in 1955 was trying to make work. The 200 acres, the tractor without a roll bar, the PTO shaft without a guard, the pesticides without adequate protective equipment, the commodity prices he could not influence and the input costs he could not control, was a way of life that was already in the process of being replaced by an agricultural model that needed fewer farmers, larger machinery, and more capital to produce the same or greater volume of food on the same land. The farmer of 1955 could not see exactly how that transition would unfold, but many of them could feel it in the economics of every year they farmed. The land was the same. The work was the same. The sky and the weather and the soil were the same. What was changing, with a slowness that was invisible season by season and unmistakable decade by decade, was whether a single family working that land could sustain itself on what it produced, and the answer, increasingly, was that it could not. The dangers that surrounded the American farmer in 1955, the unguarded PTO shaft, the tractor without a roll bar, the organophosphate pesticides handled without adequate protection, the grain auger, the livestock, the isolated locations that made emergency response slow and rescue uncertain were not exceptional conditions. They were the ordinary environment of the ordinary working day of an occupation that fed the country and received, in return, a fatality rate 7 times the national average and an income that more than half of its practitioners could not live on. The improvements that came later, the mandatory rollover protective structures, the PTO guards, the pesticide safety regulations, the improved emergency response in rural areas, arrived after enough people had died in preventable accidents that the accumulation of evidence could no longer be ignored. The farmer of 1955 did not have those protections. He got up before sunrise and he went to work in the field and the barn and the machine shed, doing what farmers had always done in conditions that had improved enormously from what his grandfather had faced and that remain, by any objective measure, among the most dangerous working conditions in the American economy. The sewer worker, the demolition man, the miner, the logger, each of these professions carried its specific visibility in the story of American industrial danger. The farmer carried none of that visibility because farming was understood not as an industrial occupation, but as a way of life, a calling, a heritage, a relationship to the land that preceded the category of occupational safety by millennia. The image of the American farmer that 1955 projected into its own cultural mirror was not the image of a man doing one of the most statistically dangerous jobs in the country. It was the image of independence, self-reliance, and the particular dignity of working land that your family had worked before you. That image was not false. The independence was real. The self-reliance was necessary. The connection to the land was genuine and often deeply important to the people who felt it. But it coexisted with a fatality rate that no industrial occupation would have found acceptable, with an income structure that more than half of the people living it could not survive on, and with a set of specific mechanical and chemical hazards that were killing and injuring farmers at rates that would have generated congressional hearings if they had been occurring in any factory in any American city. The farmer's danger was rural, dispersed, and culturally invisible in a way that made it easy to accept as inevitable when it was, in most of its specific forms, entirely preventable.